evening, everyone. So thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. This is a wonderful event, a wonderful venue. It suggested that I say something about the genesis of this story, and it has an interesting genesis, so I said I can do that. I was looking through a book on backpacking, and there was a chapter called Safety and Well-Being. And it had a bunch of subheadings in it, and I thought, those subheadings are a story, and I wrote that story. So thank you very much.
Safety and well-being. Most emergencies are preventable, but you should be prepared for them. Backpacking basics. First aid. We set up what my husband Josh called base camp, a term both silly and frightening with its connotations of Mount Everest disasters, near a narrow stream. The stream was small but fierce, like some wild animal a tenth of your size that scares you anyway, a feral possum of a stream. There was something sly about it too, the way it hunkered down in the marshy grasses, then gave itself away with a secret chuckling. Our sleek yellow tent looked tiny beneath the sticky pines. Though it was June, I could smell snow in the high country. Josh set about making a fire. He laid kindling as carefully as a sculptor, struck a match as gracefully as a symphony conductor raising a baton. The fire to end all fires. I sorted through the pouches of freeze-dried food, looking for something remotely edible. I settled on beef chop suey because the picture on the package looked the worst. When eating packaged food, I had a theory that any effort that manufacturers made to make it look good on the package was effort they didn't spend on making it taste good. I struggled to open my new Swiss Army knife and sliced a shallow gash in my finger. Josh looked up from the fire when I yelped, "You okay?" I nodded, feeling my face grow red from tears I held in. Josh would never cut himself on his Swiss Army knife. When we were dating, his competence at all manner of things made me feel secure. At 28, I dated a lot of men who were basically screw-ups, but Josh pumped my gas, rescued the earring I dropped down the sink, and assembled a bookshelf for my living room. How was I to know that the calm competence that attracted me would end up just 1 year later making me feel emotional and alarmist by contrast? Josh had suggested backpacking for our vacation. And though Maui was more my style, I went along with it, hoping that the time together would help us find some kind of balance between us. "Let me get you a Band-Aid," he said, sounding way too patient. "I can do it." Josh turned back to the fire, which was apparently on life support and required him blowing on it every 3 seconds. Through half-squinting eyes, I fumbled into the tent for the first aid kit. Josh had already laid out the blue Memi bags side by side, not touching. I stepped back outside. "Why didn't you zip the sleeping bags together when you set up the tent?" "The bags hold in heat better this way." He answered without turning from the fire. I should have known he would have a practical explanation. I'd hoped we'd at least improve our slumping sex life while we were out here, but it looked like that was one more thing I wouldn't enjoy about backpacking. Prevention. To prevent injury on your trip, don't take chances, especially near the end of a long hike. Backpacking basics. "How long till we get back to camp?" I asked, trying to sound reasonable, not like a whiny kid. We'd hiked out early in the morning to a waterfall that Josh had read about in one of his trail guides. He'd shown me a stunning picture when we were planning our trip. Unfortunately, it was still too early for peak snowmelt, so when we finally got to the waterfall, it looked more like a hose left running than a thundering torrent. Now it was 3:30, and the day had started out clear, but had turned sullen and cloudy as we retraced our steps. "Well, we have a few more miles," Josh said, professionally detached, like a doctor delivering bad test results. "Oh, great," I said. Josh ignored me, stamping a little as we walked to let me know he was angry. I had to pick up his little signals to figure out what was going on behind his calm facade. I was getting good at it, but I resented having to get good at it. My boots bit into my heels with every step, and my socks were clammy with sweat. At least we had left the heavy equipment back at base camp, so I didn't have to struggle under the weight of my bedroll like Wile E. Coyote under an anvil. When I started lagging behind him, Josh insisted on my leading the way so I could set the pace. I could feel his restraint at my slower steps like a motor revving behind me. At first, I hiked faster. Then, I deliberately slowed. This was all his idea. He could suffer along with me. Our first few months together, I'd felt grown up and settled, as I always thought I should be. We read the paper over breakfast and watched TV tucked together on the sofa after dinner like an old married couple. I remembered my increasing fear as my 20s crept on. My friends were all sailing serenely into marriage, while I felt like the last single woman on earth. I was so glad to meet someone attractive and stable that we married 5 months after we met. Marriage to him was a safe harbor after the frenzy of dating, I thought. But then things started to annoy me, like how he'd make suggestions about a better way to chop onions when I was cooking. And I started to annoy him by wanting to talk everything to death, like how it made me feel when he told me how to cook. I couldn't let anything go. "Hey, stop a minute." Josh's voice came from behind me. I turned on him, irritated. Once I lost my stride, I was afraid I'd be too tired to start again. "I noticed this trail off to the side earlier when we came up. I'm sure it's the one my guidebook talked about, a steeper path that's a shortcut." I was already exhausted. I said, "Good," and followed him. Bad weather. If really bad weather strikes, seek shelter or turn back. Backpacking basics. The new path was so steep, I felt like my legs were suddenly the wrong length. Every downhill step, a jolt. I untied my flannel shirt from around my waist and put it on. At least we were both in long pants, though Josh wore only a short-sleeved shirt. He didn't seem cold. But maybe he was just being macho. This path was narrower than the one we had left. Trees loomed over me, shutting out the little remaining daylight. I shuffled my feet to drown out the small, scurrying, whispering noises that were all around me. It came to me suddenly that I hated the woods. My whole body was tense from my need to run and run until I was somewhere clean and warm. "I'm glad we're taking this shortcut," Josh said. "It looks like it might start raining soon." Hypothermia. Shivering will eventually consume your energy reserves until they are exhausted. When this happens, cold reaches your brain, depriving you of judgment and reasoning power. Backpacking basics. We hiked downward, Josh in the lead, the trees and rocky walls shouldering out the sky. Raindrops blasted leaves far above us, like rifle shots in a war movie. When I looked up, a drop hit my forehead, huge and cold. "It's starting," I said. Josh just walked faster. Soon the rain was drumming on my head, and my flannel shirt was soaked through. Goosebumps covered Josh's arms. "Maybe we should get out of the rain," I said. Josh turned on me faster than I had ever seen him move. "Like where? Maybe under a tree? A good tall one that would be a lightning rod?" "Okay, let's not try to get out of the rain. But let's at least keep walking. When I stop, I freeze." Even in this little pause, I started to shiver. Josh was shivering too, I noticed with satisfaction. Being lost. First, sit down and think. When were you last on familiar ground? Backpacking basics. Cold water leached into my bones. By now I was shivering so hard the world was jumping around me. The trail was a bare thread of mud between hulking bushes. The dark, primitive smell of wet earth was like breathing a thick tangle of roots. "Are you sure this is a trail, Josh?" He continued marching like a robot, so I poked his shoulder blade with my finger. He spun. "Of course I'm sure. Asking stupid questions won't get us back to camp any sooner." There was a wild look in his eyes I had never seen before. "I don't think we're even heading the right direction." I made my voice stronger than I felt. "We are. When we left the main trail, we were headed west." I thought of the zigzagging trail, the trees shutting out the sky, night falling without stars. "I think we're lost." "We're not lost," he shouted. His voice didn't echo. The air around us was thick as wool. He drew in a deep breath. "We probably have another half hour or so of walking before we reach camp," he continued, in a parody of his usual reasonable voice. His teeth started chattering. He clamped them together. Mr. Tough Guy to the last. "I'm going back." It wasn't logic. I just knew I couldn't continue into the unknown darkness. "Don't be foolish. You'll never make it all the way back up the trail before dark. We're close to camp now." Rain dripped off the end of his nose. "Don't be foolish," I mimicked. "We're lost, and you're too foolish to admit it." "What do you know about it? You've never been backpacking in your life. Think, you're just overreacting." "I'm not overreacting. I'm being careful." I struggled to keep my voice steady. "I'm being careful. You're flying off the handle." He took a deep breath. "I know what I'm doing, and now is really not the time to be getting hysterical." Rage burned through me. "Hysterical? Of course I'm hysterical. We're lost in the woods in the rain, and you're going the wrong way." At that moment, I never wanted to see him again. Anger flashed across his face. I felt triumphant at cracking his calm. "Fine," he said. "I'll see you back at camp. By the time you get there, I'll already be warm and dry." He tramped down the narrow path without a backward glance. I took a deep breath and started slogging uphill. Minimum safety package. There is a minimum safety package for use in the wilderness. Waterproof matches, map, compass, a little food, rain gear, a warm garment, a whistle, a knife, and a first aid kit. I always carry these things, even when I have to leave my pack to make a side excursion. I've never been lost, but if I ever get a little confused, these things will be most handy. Backpacking basics. My legs were trembling. We'd hiked from the main trail a good hour, which meant even longer going back. I had a little water and a power bar. Josh had water and snacks too. I thought he probably had his Swiss Army knife. It was a guy thing. I'd left mine back at camp. More importantly, I'd left my flashlight. If I didn't make it back to the main trail before complete darkness, I'd be thrashing around in the bushes all night. When I thought of his reasonable voice saying, "Don't be foolish," I didn't care if he froze to death, and that scared me more than anything. The rain was no longer pounding down, but falling at a quiet pace. There was still enough water to slide down the back of my neck, though. I put my head down and kept climbing. When I came to a place where the trail forked, I bent to look for the deep welts our boots had made in the mud on the way down. Stopping made me realize the weakness in my legs and arms, the weight of my nylon day pack drawing me downward to sit, to rest. But I knew if I stopped, I would never get going again. When the main trail opened up before me, it looked wide and beautiful in the last glimmers of light. The trees seemed calmer here, not thrashing so much in the wind and rain. Then I realized the rain was just a drizzle now. My boots were so caked with mud, I felt like I was wearing ankle weights. When I got to the trailhead near our camp, it was full dark, but my eyes were used to it. I could see the outlines of trees I recognized, hear the brook twice as loud as before after the rain. I followed the sound toward our campsite. When I got close, I realized there was no light, no fire, no Josh. The right companions. In my experience, the greatest threat to well-being and safety is the wrong companions. Backpacking basics. I stole into camp like coming into a house late at night after everyone is asleep. But there was a cold silence in the camp, nothing stirring except that awful chuckling stream that was now swollen to full laughter. When I unzipped the tent, my hands were so clumsy I had trouble lifting the zipper. The thin material sprayed water on my face and hands, but I hardly noticed it. No Josh in the tent. I felt around for my flashlight and swept the beam over the tent as if I thought Josh would be hunched in the corner. But everything was just as we had left it. Our extra clothes stacked along the sides, our sleeping bags with a polite 4 inches between them. I had really expected him to be back first. Though the rain had stopped, I was shivering harder than ever now. I took off my wet clothes and left them in a pile by the tent door. I put on every layer I had, then I went out to try and build a fire. Josh had been rationing our kindling, but I used it all. The only dry paper was the mystery novel I had brought along and left in the tent. I tore out the pages with shaking hands and crumpled them. I lit matches and blew on the fire, copying Josh. When the kindling caught, I added dry wood from the bottom of our wood pile and stretched my hands out to the flame. I couldn't even feel the heat. I brought my sleeping bag and pad out of the tent and laid them next to the fire. I slipped into my sleeping bag, sitting upright. I knew I shouldn't sleep. I should stay awake until I knew Josh was okay. I should stay awake so that at the first sign of rain, I could go into the tent. I should stay awake for Josh. I should go after him, I thought, but I couldn't take another step. My brain seemed as cold and clumsy as my hands. I couldn't quite believe I had made it back and he hadn't. Maybe he'll come back to camp any minute, I told myself. But in my mind, I saw him still marching through the bushes, a calm look frozen on his face as he told himself camp was just around the corner. "Josh," I yelled. "Josh!" The stream was louder than my voice, and the wind in the pine was out shouting me. "Josh!" I kept at it in a kind of delirium, the kind of dream where you run and run but stand still, where you yell and no sound comes, where your lover's face melts into the face of a stranger. Drying out. If you're lucky enough to have sunshine soon after the rain, use that to dry out. Think of how to avoid getting soaked the next time. Backpacking basics. I came awake all at once, like I'd been slapped. It was morning, and I was beside the ashes of the fire. Sunlight pounded my head. No sign of Josh around the fire. I jumped out of my sleeping bag and ran my stocking feet to the tent. It was unzipped, empty. Josh's bag was still flat and neat, its mummy shape making me shiver. Josh was out there somewhere, in who knows what condition, and there was no one to help him but me. Cautious backpackers would have a radio, a flare for summoning help, but we didn't. I had been surprised that my cell phone didn't work up here. Help was a day's hike away from our camp, and I already felt limp and exhausted. Everything in me rebelled at the thought of plunging back into the tall trees, the narrow trail that might not be a trail at all. But I had to go look for him. I never should have left him in the first place. I shouldn't have gotten so angry. I should have reasoned with him instead of shouting. It was time for me to stop feeling like I was the hysterical one and start being the calm, logical one. It was time to really be a grown-up. I was hungry and felt guilty about it. I pulled my shoes over my damp socks and got some dried fruit. As I chewed, I went through Josh's things, taking inventory. He had been carrying his compass, which gave me a little hope. I had left mine at camp, and now I wondered why I had been so stupid as to wander away from Josh without a compass, and to wonder why Josh hadn't checked his compass. Neither of us had been thinking straight. It was dumb luck that had brought me out of the woods last night. His Swiss Army knife was gone, and so was his emergency rain poncho. I realized he had had it in his pack all along. I didn't know if he was so confused he never noticed or if he deliberately left it tucked away because he thought he wouldn't need it. I hoped it would be enough to keep him safe, but I didn't know. I loaded my backpack with extra clothes for Josh, matches, food. As I went through the supplies, I remembered our argument over which packages to buy. I could still see Josh pointing out the advantages of beef with rice, high in protein, over my choice, spaghetti with mushrooms, hopefully higher in flavor. It was so easy in hindsight to see how wrong we always were for each other. I don't think he would have left a stranger to fend for herself in that weather, and I don't think I would have either. But we had left each other. I knew he could be cold, wet, wandering through the trackless forest, or worse, but I tried not to picture him in any of those ways. Instead, I tried to picture him building a shelter out of tree branches cut with his Swiss Army knife, using the rain poncho as a tarp. Safe and reasonable, not wild-eyed, with hair plastered to his forehead and his arms knotted with goosebumps. Not the way I had last seen him. I squatted next to the chuckling stream and filtered enough water to fill my canteen. I took a long drink, like an ancient hunter, defeating my enemy and then consuming it. I wrote a note on the inside cover of my mystery novel. Josh, if you're reading this, I've gone out to look for you. I didn't sign it, love. The trail was still soupy. In some places, it had turned into a mini stream, the water carving deep ruts through the mud. I had to step along the edge to keep from slipping, especially where wind-felled branches dammed the water. Everything was painfully bright with sunlight and sparkling drops glaring. I found Josh not far down the side trail, prone under a tree, wrapped in his rain poncho. He had decided to turn back after all, but hadn't made it to camp. He was very still, the poncho littered with pine needles. I ran to him, unable to tell if he was breathing. I dove to the mud beside him, stuck my hand against his cold cheek. He opened his eyes, looking at me without recognition. I had to get him dry and warm, back to camp, back to the fire and the sleeping bag. I shook his shoulders, trying to rouse him from his stupor. Amy? He said at last. I tried to rub some heat into his cold hands. You're safe, I said, knowing it was always a lie.